I'm here with Michelle Walter, PhD candidate and university tutor here at the Youth Research Centre at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. Thank you very much, Michelle, for giving me the time for this interview today. Let me begin by asking you about the definition of autoethnography. Can you explain to us what is autoethnography?
Autoethnography is a research methodology, which makes it sound quite boring. But what it is a way of trying to use storytelling, emotion, feelings as a way to explore cultural and social phenomenon. So it's a way of looking at your personal experiences and seeing how they enact in culture. So for example, if you're someone who is, say, I'll use teaching because teaching is a good example, and you want to examine your own practice, you might record what you've been doing for a day, you might look at your own feelings towards a particular class, you might look at your own lesson planning, and then you might interrogate that in the context of what the research says around teaching and what good teaching is or what good pedagogy is. It's a way of trying to make the personal cultural, or seeing how the cultural enacts in the personal sphere. And this can often happen with particular groups that might be more marginalised. The example I often use is mental illness. So a way of where autoethnography may work is someone might explore their experiences of being mentally ill, but instead of just telling the story of their mental illness, which might put it in the place of autobiography, which is different, they will explore that experience in the context of the wider culture. So if there's someone who are feeling very stigmatised, they might have a look at where is that stigma coming from. Is it coming from television? Is it coming from radio? Is it coming from what's on social media? And how does that then feed into their daily life? It's also a methodology, as I just mentioned, that utilises a lot of the traditional literary techniques in storytelling. It also uses images, it can use film, it can use poetry, it can use music as a way to express the data. A really fantastic example of that is one called Heavier Than Air, which was a play written by Anne Harris and another researcher whose name I've unfortunately forgotten, but they went around Australia looking at the experiences of queer teachers. So they went to rural Australia, they went to urban Australia, they went to cities, they went to suburbs, and they interviewed them in a very traditional ethnographic way. So you sit down, interview, what's your experience of being a queer teacher? And then they took all that data and they created 6 composite characters. So it was everything that the participants had said, but it was mixed together to make 6, I guess, typical characters, typical feelings of those teachers. So there was like a teacher who was rural, and there was a character who was from a very accepting sort of city-based school. And then they created dialogue and they created a play out of that. And I'm still thinking about that, and that's 3 years ago. And the difference is also that Anne Harris and Stacey Holman Jones, who wrote the textbook on autoethnography, they were both part of it. And they're both queer and they're both teachers. So they're both in that education space. So they were part of the group that they were researching. But they didn't just tell their own stories. They took other data, but they also incorporated their own sense of what it meant to be a queer teacher.
And what makes autoethnography perhaps different from other methods of research?
I think what makes autoethnography different is that it takes into account, or I guess privileges emotions and personal experience as being a worthwhile source of data. Some of this came out of a broader movement, so what was happening in feminism, for example, in the academy, and this recognition of the domestic sphere and the personal being important. But beyond that, it sees what you feel and what you think about a particular issue as just as good data as you might get out of observation, for example. Also in the way that it's presented, that makes it quite unique in the fact that we can draw on literary techniques, say dialogue, for example, or if you want to create a film out of your data and present it that way, that's seen as something that's legitimate in autoethnography. I think also what it's unashamedly a methodology that has an agenda and that is a social justice agenda. And it says that quite distinctly in the handbook, but possibly at the very beginning, actually. And the purpose of autoethnography is not simply to illuminate a phenomenon or to add knowledge to the world, though that is something that they see as crucial. It's about trying to change the world and make it a better place. And they do that through empathy, through creating fellow feeling, through speaking to your emotions as much as your brain. Because the idea is that if you come to know a marginalised group, whoever that group may be, and you recognise them as people, it's much harder for you to then reject them. And it's also about opening up spaces of conversation that otherwise might get shut down. So in research, you might traditionally find that it's very male dominated, it's very white male dominated, and it's still very white male dominated, though that is starting to be changed. And it's about opening up space for people who are from different places to speak. So someone who is, say, an Indigenous person, giving them a space to speak and be heard on their own terms and in their own voices.
And what are some of the ways in which autoethnography can perhaps be used in educational research?
So one of the ways that I think autoethnography can really lend itself to the educative space is that it draws on something that teachers do naturally already, is that we think reflexively. We reflect on our practice. We think, why did that lesson go so well? Why did that lesson, go so badly? How was my teaching impacted by, this new activity that I tried? And it sees that as a legitimate, but not only legitimate, but important source of data. So an example of that I like to use is if you're in a classroom and your theory of how to be a teacher is to always be really innovative, activity-based, very little teacher talk, that you're always going to have something new and innovative, and you're always going to be approachable, and you're always going to have all your marking in on time, and if you see a kid's upset, you're going to make time to speak to them. And you have all these ideals that you come into the classroom with. And then you start teaching, and some of those ideals are starting to fall by the wayside. Your marking is late. You see kids upset, but you just don't have the time or the space to speak to them. You're teaching from the textbook. You've just yelled at a child simply because, they talk to their neighbour. And what you're experiencing in that classroom means that you are not living up to what your ideal of a teacher is. So instead of saying that I'm a bad teacher or I need to be better or I can't live up to my ideals, you start thinking, what's actually happening? What is my data showing me about potentially this gap between what is written down in, say, the curriculum or written down in those good teaching guides or that I got taught in the classroom when I was a student and now in the reality of my practice. And you might say, well, I've got 5 classes, each class is full of 30 children, I've got 3 leadership positions, the principal isn't very supportive, I'm very tired, and you start looking at your own experiences and how can they then inform practice. And then you might say that, well, what I can add to research here is looking at the practicality of trying to implement what is written in the curriculum or what is written in research. And I think that's particularly key when you're looking at social justice, because so many of us have ideals of how we'll behave in the classroom. I think the example that I used before is if you have a student or several students who potentially don't have great home lives, and that how they're acting up in the classroom is a representation of that, but maybe one day you lose it and you do all those things you said that you'd never do, and you yell at them and maybe you call them useless and you chuck them to the principal, even though that won't help. And then suddenly you're sitting there and again there's that gap between the reality of your classroom and your ideals of practice. So with autoethnography you say that data is really important. You don't say that's just your own observation, you need participants to tell you exactly what you already know. You say no, what I'm seeing here is the realities of all the pressures that are on teachers, and what's being put by the wayside is my teaching practice, and then my mental health, and then my emotional health. And then you might use that research to then hopefully inform policy or maybe inform practice in other ways.
My next question is about the ways in which autoethnography can be used to serve a social justice imperative or agenda in educational research.
As human beings, we're categorized in different ways. The most obvious of that is in relation to gender. And what we are allowed to do is very much dictated by gender. So if you're a boy, you don't cry, you play with trucks, and you have to be very loud and aggressive. That means if you're a boy who doesn't fit into those categories, maybe you get in trouble in different ways. And if you're a girl, you're supposed to be quiet, emotional, and play with dolls. I'm being very basic here, but that's those representations. And this idea of the artificial binary. So if we have a line and there are two options and we're one or we are the other. And if you believe that, then discrimination is built in because you treat boys and girls differently because of their gender. So what I try and do with that is I look at that in the context of mental illness. So if we have that binary here and that line down the middle, we have mental illness on one side, and that says someone who is mentally ill, they are incompetent, they are weak of character, maybe they're not trying hard enough, maybe there's something genetically wrong with them, they have to be coddled, they're irresponsible, they can't be trusted, we have to be very careful with them. And then if we have the other binary here, which is teacher. And when we think of teacher, we think hopefully someone who's educated, someone who's wise, someone who wants to create a better place in the world, someone who can make decisions, someone who's intelligent. You've got so much responsibility as a teacher, whether you're teaching at university or kindergarten or primary school or secondary school. You are in a position of educating the future of the country, to put a very, dramatic flair on it. And then what I say is, well, I'm someone who is a teacher, but I'm also someone with mental illness. So I'm trying to disrupt that binary by standing up in front of my peers, in front of my classes, when I give lectures, and I put that very up front. And I don't try and turn it into the focus of everything that I do, but I point that out. And that's one way that I'm using my story as a way of trying to break down stigma for other people. And then I guess the other example, which I'll bring it back to teaching here, is most of us know that recently there's been some quite racist rhetoric around particular young people in the suburbs of Melbourne's west. And with that, you might say that if you're someone who's teaching those young people, for example, you see them every day in the classroom, and you know that a lot of the racial rhetoric is not true. You know, they're not violent, they're not in gangs, they're not going around destroying society. So you might think, well, what can I do as a teacher who knows these young people? Autoethnographically, you might then take your experience of them as human beings, as young people, and translate that into a narrative. And you might represent that story in the research space. So you might take your experience of them as a way to try and shift our understanding of who these young people are, to try and break down the stigma of who they are, as a way to try and stop them being discriminated against. And it's a very overt and very active way that you can use research in seeking out social justice.
And finally, I would like to ask you, what are some of the benefits of autoethnography for teachers who would like to use themselves and their own practices as a source of data for research?
Autoethnography legitimizes what you're already doing in the research space. It means, in a very practical way, teachers are very, very, very busy. And you don't necessarily have time to then go out and do a whole separate research project where you have to source participants. You can use the data that you're already creating through observations, through your own reflections, through your lesson plans, through your meetings with other colleagues and your observations of those colleagues as data. So you don't have to double up in that way. Also, education is a space that really lends itself to story. So if you are trying to get across to your, say, a parent or a principal or another teacher, a difficulty that you're having in your classroom, if you then tell a story about a particular pupil or that particular problem, people will hear you, as opposed to if you're spouting statistics. And in that, what I'm saying is that autoethnography can translate research That means that people who are outside of the academy often can hear it much better and they respond to it much better. And I'm not saying that autoethnography is the only way to do research. I don't believe that. I really, really don't. But I think in the education space, it's a really fantastic methodology. And especially if you're starting out in research, it's a way for you to find out if research is something that you want to do. I think because many educators are also people who are striving for social justice, or even if it's not explicitly social justice, it's for a better world. And this is a methodology that lends itself really well to that. It states that in its, I want to say the Autoethnography Manifesto, that is fundamentally what it's about. It also means that it can deepen your own practice because you are explicitly trying to observe for research. It means that you are more aware of what you're doing, say, in the classroom, in your conversation with colleagues, in the schoolyard, and it really trains that reflective eye. It also means that even if you do nothing else with your research, you can use it as a way to inform your own practice. You might have something happen in your classroom, like you do an activity and it works really fantastically, and you've got your own observations about that activity. Then you can say, well, I know it worked, but what does the research say why it worked? And then that means that you can then potentially replicate that in your next lesson. So I think fundamentally it's very practical, it values storytelling, and it can really develop your skills as a practitioner, even if you do not wish to go into research. And just last point, I also think it's research that's often very interesting to read because it's based on story. Right? Most of us, when we look at research projects, will often skip right down to the snippets of what the participants said, because as humans, that's what we want to know. We want to know the story of it, and that's what autoethnography really focuses on. And if you're someone who's creative and you want to try and open up research for people outside of that, again, you can use film, you can use photos. So there's a lot of creativity and potential in that.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for giving me the time for this interview today.